Every good story should start from the beginning, and Wildstar gives us a pretty interesting story. This is the Lore-ange Hatter Show. I know it's a bad title, don't worry about it. And this is the first in a 4-part miniseries on Wildstar Lore, because the lore of Nexus and its surrounding stories is actually pretty interesting and pretty deep, and I've always wanted to talk about it, so let's talk about it because it's awesome. Now, when you want to start with the beginning, though, anything in Wildstar begins with the Eldan. Basically, everything begins with the Eldan. But who were the Eldan? What did they do? And why are they even relevant? Well, if you've played even a little bit of Wildstar, you'll have some idea of why the Eldan are such a big deal. Or more accurately, they were such a big deal. The Eldan were a hyper-advanced race that at one point ruled over the planet Nexus. Originally from a planet we're not entirely sure of, although one has been mentioned called Orias, but we don't really have any information on it, the Eldan constructed an entire planet. This planet was Nexus, as a massive scientific facility with a singular goal in mind. This was called the Nexus Project. The Eldan, though, were hardly perfect beings as we'd assume some master race would be, as more than a few of their data cubes will attest. Despite their intelligence, they were incredibly arrogant, fickle, fought amongst each other, bordered on mental instability in some cases, and lacked a lot of common sense. They made a lot of bad choices, and in doing so, they did what a lot of races that take their namesake from Tolkien's elves does, and ruined everything. And hopefully, over the next couple of videos, I will explain why. So who were the Eldan, or more accurately, what were the Eldan? There's a couple of sources that can answer these questions for us. I use things like the lore AMAs, data cubes, Loremageddon, and the Wildstar timeline to construct my interpretation, but you might have some different ideas as well. But first of all, what were the Eldan like, and what did they look like? So, there's no real intact Eldan within Wildstar anymore. At least, none that aren't coated in a fine layer of purple goop. So we don't really have too much to go on. There are, though, a couple of examples we can draw an idea from. So first off, we have Elven Architecture. They really like to build statues of themselves, because of course they did. So we have this look of sort of lithe and slender elven forms with long, pointed ears. This is reflected in the Caretaker, an artificial intelligence that the Eldan created to rule over Nexus while they were gone. Drusera, the end result of the entire Nexus project, and the Lumini, who are Elden-human hybrids. So we can really assume that the Eldan were space elves. I mean, we have the long pointed ears, lithe and slender features, and a general arrogance on all of these examples, so we're basically dealing with Warhammer 40,000 Eldar here. I could be wrong, this is kind of an extrapolation, but this is what I think they look like when I think Eldan. But what were they like? So the Eldan we know about were mostly the ones somehow involved in the Nexus project, which is to say scientists and engineers. Mind you, their culture was very deeply tied up in this project, so much so that it's likely that a majority of their population may have been on Nexus at the time of their disappearance, which would explain why we can't really find any more of them. The Eldan were deeply tied into what they do and how they contribute to their scientific goals, which in this case was almost overwhelmingly the Nexus project. The Eldan really didn't have too much of a differentiation between work life and home life, spending most of their hours advancing the needs of the Nexus project, and when they weren't doing that, discussing the Nexus project with their coworkers. They kind of were consumed in this idea, though they did have a good idea of what home and family was like, displayed when they designed things like Dominus for the Cassians, which I'll get into in their own video. Is this all that the Eldan did? Was their entire race devoted to the Nexus project? We quite frankly don't know. We only have what's available to us, which is largely tied in with the Nexus project. Again, there could be entire Eldan worlds out there that we just haven't found because they're so far beyond the fringe that we haven't run into them yet. Orias might still be teeming with Eldan life. We just don't know right now. As far as we know, all Eldan in existence ceased to exist at the completion of the Nexus project. I'll get into that later. But first, let's talk about how Eldan structure was designed in relation to the Nexus project. First of all, The Elden involved with the Nexus project were cleanly divided into 6 orders based upon their function within the project itself. These orders are the Makers, the Shapers, the Evokers, the Weavers, the Progenitors, and the Watchers, each with a very specific function. Finally, these groups were overseen by the Archon, Joriel, a man I will get into later. But first, the Makers. These Elden were responsible for all of their technology. Most likely they were a hard research and development team of mythical space elves. They gave us such wonderful treats as augmentation and the various mechanical Elden mobs, as well as annihilators, those giant robots that fire lasers out of their eyes. Freaking lasers out of their eyes. We have a couple of notable members of the Makers to talk about. Vorian was probably the most intelligent and most well-renowned member of this group. He's an Elden famed for building giant death machines, going crazy, and being consumed by the strain in his lab. He also is probably the reason why the Caretaker is so horribly broken, by introducing the Avatus Is it Avatus? Avatus? I think it's pronounced Avatus. Protocols into the Caretaker's mind, which could be responsible for shattering it. He removed himself from the list of potential Elden to be merged into Drusera pretty early on, in order to oversee the production of the Genesis Prime himself. This could have forced Joriel's hand into either nominating himself or Nazarick, 2 people who probably should not have been part of Drusera's creation. But more on that later. This cast also gave us a gentleman named Zarkonis, who due in part to being in the same cast as Vorian, who's largely a brilliant mind, but also probably because he suffered from some serious inferiority issues. He tended to overcompensate when it came to destructive power in Elden weapons. We can probably pin the Annihilators on him, as well as changes to the Augmented to make them more deadly. But we can also pin one other thing, recombination, which is what Mr. Antiven's brother horribly succumbed to and is now leading a cult in worship of. Next up are the Shapers. Oddly, of all the casts, this one seems to be populated both by level heads and people who are criminally overlooked. The Shapers were responsible for shaping planets, either created through terraforming or just manipulating primal energies to form all sorts of different landscapes. Largely, they manipulated matter. The most important member of this group is Coral, who was one of the first Elden to realize the danger posed by the strain. After that, we have the Progenitors, one of the more controversial casts, and one prone to a lot of infighting between its luminaries. The Progenitors were responsible for creating and cultivating all manner of life on Nexus. We can blame them for the Osen, the Skeech, and the Squirg. At the top level, we have Nazarick, a brilliant, deranged, egotistical maniac, and Omna, somewhat more level-headed person until you started messing with her babies. Nazarick would be one of the 6 chosen to become part of Drusera in what could be the most catastrophically stupid idea in all of Elden history, and may have potentially tampered with the creation of everybody's favorite blue bush stalker. More of that later, though, in her own video. As deranged as anybody in this video game could possibly be, Nazarick gave the Moody's the gift of necromancy and created brain parasites called the Squirg because he was bored. Omna, on the other hand, created the Skeech, which is possibly an even greater crime than anything Nazarick could have done, and saw herself kind of as a mother of her creation. I'm sure that didn't directly lead her to becoming a tumor worm in the genetic archives, but, who knows. Nazarick and Omna fought a lot. A lot. More so when Nazarick decided to warp the genetics of the Skeech females to look like horrible tumorous monsters. Those poor Skeech bastards. Next up, we have 2 castes that are kind of interrelated. At least in the lore, it seems like they're fairly interrelated. This would be the Weavers and the Evokers, and I lump these castes together because they touch on the same thing. Both of them focus on primal particle physics, the Elden primal energies that they used at the basis of their science. These are 6 forces that exist within the universe, 4 forces of matter, primal earth, fire, water, and air, and the 2 forces of energy, primal life and primal logic. While in the lore, they're kind of nebulous in what they do, both seem to play with primal energies a lot, Weavers seem to be more theoretical, working out new ways to study primal energies and better understand them, infusing them with matter, both animate or inanimate. The Evokers, on the other hand, focus more on applications of primal energy. They're responsible for such things as elementals and various other practical applications of primal energy, it seems like. So that's my shorthand. The Weavers are primal energy scientists who ask, why does it work? And the Evokers are primal energy engineers who ask, how does it work? Out of these two groups, we get a couple of them chosen to be Drusera, which, that's no big deal. They're kind of lower level characters than people like Nazarick or Joriel. But we also have Yuria, who became the primeval of Water Hydrus. She's insane. That was a terrible idea. Again, a terrible idea. At a certain point, we start to see the bad decisions of the Eldans start to mount, but we'll get more into that later. And finally, we have the final group, the Watchers. These are the accountants, auditors, supply chain managers, and archivists of the Eldan. I'm serious. The Watchers are responsible for ensuring each caste has what it needs, and that they are doing everything up to code with the Eldan standards. They were responsible for compiling the collective knowledge gleaned from the project. We have Ionis in this group as chief among the Watchers. She was a quartermaster and tended to have the gift of foresight, though based on how a lot of the Eldan tended to act, you could really just say she had common sense. Of course, she too was mashed up into Drusera. And finally, we have Archon Joriel. He was the big head honcho of the Nexus project, basically completely in charge. No action can be taken without his say-so, though many were, and his will effectively was carried out by the Watchers. In one of the more short-sighted moves of the entire project, he nominated himself to be part of Drusera. All of this was bound up in the Nexus project. The entire goal of the Eldan's creation of Nexus, the Nexus project represented the ultimate ascension of the Eldan into perfection. Now, this might seem like a bunch of ephemeral jargon until you realize that they meant this literally. The Eldan wanted to become perfect beings, capable of rewriting immutable laws of nature, transcending existence into a truly perfect form. This was the goal of the Nexus project. And through this, everything from augmentation to the protoplasmic resonator was tied up in this one goal. But it could also be responsible for their disappearance. It's made clear in an Enigma report, and by everybody's favorite maybe stalkerish blue goddess, that the Eldan were wiped out shortly after the completion of the Genesis Prime. Data cubes point to the strain and the entity being the culprit here. They emerged shortly after the end of the Nexus project and after the creation of Drusera. The Progenitors worked at studying these new entities, but despite the fact that they realized they couldn't stop them, they thought that they posed no significant threat to the Nexus project as a whole. Only Coral, the only Eldan I can think of who's probably not mentally unstable, completely egotistical, or lacks common sense, believed that the strain are a much greater threat than anybody thought it was. Sadly, this doesn't save the Eldan from their eventual fate. The Enigma report, or I guess the Secret Ops report if you're the Exiles, states that the strain and the entity wiped out the Eldan, and that they were annihilated when they attempted to destroy the entity. Most of them are probably dead. Some were consumed and twisted into some more sinister forms, but the fact is that the Eldan are gone. The Nexus project was completed though, but if this was a good thing, well, we aren't really sure. It directly relates to the eventual obliteration of the Eldan, the creation of Drusera, and the creation of the entity in Strain. I'll decipher more on this question in the Genesis Prime episode that's coming up. But for now, we have an understanding of what the Eldan were, what they wanted to accomplish on Nexus, and now we can move towards more contemporary things in the next episode, covering the Dominion. Thanks for watching, and you all have a great one.